Hi, and welcome or welcome back to the Future of SaaS Festival. We hope you're enjoying the presentation so far. Just a quick reminder, if you're not already a member of our Slack community, follow the link at the top of the event website to network and join the discussion.
Hi, lovely people. I think we are live. It's like we have Marco from VMware. We have Sarah from Palo Alto Networks. We're just waiting on one more. Oh, look at that. Perfect. We got Cynthia from Google.
Good morning, everyone.
Welcome.
Good morning. Good afternoon.
Good morning.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Yeah, good afternoon for several people.
Yeah, for some people we're having our first cup of coffee. For some people, for others, we're getting ready to have our dinner. So welcome. As we kick things off, just want to go ahead and give some proper introductions. We have myself, Kalina Bryant, from Unapologetic Podcast, being your host today. And we also have Sarah Pupis from Palo Alto Networks, gracing us with all of her knowledge. We have Marco Karuba from VMware, the only man on the panel, highlighting diversity for us here. Lovely to have you. And we have the wonderful Cynthia Hester from Google, gracing us with her leadership, her presence. So delighted to have you all here.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Before we kick things off, I wanted to give you just a little bit of an opportunity to introduce yourself a little bit more before we dive in. So if possible, Marco, could we start off with you? Tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do at VMware, and why are you so passionate about diversity in SaaS?
Yes, with pleasure. So first of all, I'm Italian, based in London, working VMware. I run the EMEA customer success team. And I've always been passionate about the different points of views and the different behaviors and the different cultures. And in fact, as a hobby, been traveling a lot, but also do a lot of street photography to capture the expressions and the reactions of people around the world. So that's a little bit about me. And in VMware, I found, I'm lucky because I found a way to express myself and express my thinking about diversity and inclusion also at work. So I'm glad to be here.
Thank you, Marco. And over to you, Sarah.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and good afternoon, good morning to everybody. I'm based in Milan. I'm Italian as well, and I'm the channel marketing manager covering the south region of EMEA, I would say. So I'm being always part of cultural diverse and geographical dispersed teams, and inclusion, equity, and diversity. It's truly part of me, because this is the way in which I interact with others. And it's really important, not only on the professional side of me, but also on the personal side of me. So I'm really happy to be here today.
Awesome. And without further ado, Cynthia.
Hi, everyone. I'm Cynthia Hester. Good morning, good afternoon for those of you who are coming to the end of your day, and morning for those of us who are just getting started. I, as Kalina just said, am working at Google right now. I lead the global customer programs team, and I've been doing this type of work around customer experience for a number of years. And when you do this type of work, from my perspective, there's no way to actually have it be rich and engaging without having it include all the voices. And for me, that really embodies diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is, we'll talk a little bit more about it, but it's been, I think, a lifelong passion. It's certainly one of my key values that I bring to work every day, and I kind of move through the world in that way. And I'm really excited about talking about this and how it relates to SaaS, because I do believe we do our best work when all the voices are heard and seen.
Awesome. Well, thank you. I'm delighted to just be in a room with you all. As you all know, I'm very passionate about diversity and inclusion and the tech industry. And so as we get into it, our topic for today is how diverse voices contribute to SaaS. And when we think about that, I'd like to kick things off. Oh, sorry. I don't know if you guys hear a little background noise, but I'd like to kick things off by just starting off with the first question and getting things going and understanding, what does diversity and inclusion mean to you? I think that is a very broad question, and we have multiple different answers. So as we get into the conversation, I would love to understand, maybe from Cynthia, your perspective, and go around the table. And if we have some Q&A coming in on the chat, I'll sort of throw those in, but we also, audience, will leave room for Q&A our last 15 minutes. So Cynthia, tell us a little bit, what does diversity and inclusion mean to you in your industry?
I mean, for me, and I've been in tech most of my career, and this really means, diversity to me means having lots of people at the table, lots of different voices, and inclusion is really listening, hearing, and acknowledging those voices. And equity is how you create a sense of belonging, so that people not only show up, but they show up and they feel valued and they feel empowered to share their voice. And again, as I said earlier in the introduction, this is the way to do your best work, because I don't have all the answers. None of us do, really. And so the more inclusive you can be, and the more people feel a sense of belonging, they bring all of their energy, all of their point of view, and all of their perspective. And this is where you get fresh new ideas. You innovate on things, because I might have one idea, you might have another. They may not be separate, they may be okay, but together they can be amazing. And to me, that's the passion, and what a lot of what drives me is just seeing how excited people get when they're
I think
looks like
we lost Cynthia.
That's okay. She'll pop back in there. But I think as she's going in and popping back in, Marco, would love to throw that same question at you, but, from a male perspective, I would really, and also from a white male perspective, what is your thoughts on diversity and inclusion, especially from the lenses of being in Italy, but also having a leadership role at VMware?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. As a matter of fact, I always had a parallel question, which was, if you don't really properly experience certain situations, can you talk about diversity and inclusion? And in a way, I do experience some of it, because as I said, I live in London, I'm Italian, and sometimes there's been occasions where, there's bias from people, or I feel different in a way. But when you ask the question about, being a male, and how do you see all these and how this has an effect on my business, I think it's about having an open mind, right? Understanding that the value of diversity is having these different points of views and addressing challenges and issues that can simply, with different point of views, you can see it from a different side, right? And you can see that there are solutions, or there are ways forward that you never thought about. So for me, huddling and getting into this conversation also with my team, which is very diverse by definition. We have 9 different citizenships, 9 languages that we speak in the team. We have obviously customers who are all over the territory, and they have different behaviors, different ways, and different reactions to the business conversations. So for me, diversity is allowing representation of those not like yourself, right? And this is a very good definition, because it seamlessly applies to all of us, right? It is about understanding and respecting the difference. And then obviously there's the conversation about inclusion, which is also about allowing those voices to be heard in a way, right? And including them into a way forward or a solution, if that makes sense.
I love that. And before we move on to Sarah, Cynthia, I know you were right in the heart of it. So I want to make sure I give you the opportunity to conclude on your sentence around belonging.
Thanks. And sorry, my final comment or final Am I popping out again?
Oh, no, you're fine. Go ahead.
Okay. I was gonna say I can turn off my audio, my video if that helps. Anyway, my last thing around belonging is that I really feel like this drives a lot of innovation and excitement and passion from people. Because when you feel like you belong, part of a community, part of a group, whether that's work, friends, family, just as you move around the world, I really believe you bring a much stronger and authentic energy to the table. And that's what excites me about encouraging people to embrace that. And to echo some things that Marco said, it by definition includes all of us. And that is a really, really, to me, just a beautiful thing.
I love that. And thank you for that. And Sarah, I know when we were briefly speaking, you touched on something so magical. You said, call it what it is, being a white woman, but also having so much passion to make sure people feel included. That really touched my heart. So would love to just hear your perspective on diversity and inclusion in this environment, especially coming from Palo Alto Networks and the leadership that you bring. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. Diversity, equity, inclusion, to me, it's not the way about treating people the way you want to be treated, but it's more about treating people the way they want to be treated. And it brings us to a kind of curiosity around the others, what Cynthia mentioned and Marco mentioned. And it also embraces different topics like, not only the emotional intelligence and the active listening, but also the cultural intelligence and how to be aware about the bias that we all have in the professional and in our personal life. Just to, to make a pragmatical experience. I'm Italian mother tongue. And I have a background in languages, and I can really realize when I speak in English that in Italian, so many words has a gender, and this gender influences the way in which you see the word and the concept that you have about the things that you are thinking. So the power of language in defining things is influencing my way of, and all this stuff, it's basically cancelled when it comes to speak another language. It might be English, it might be French, it might be Spanish. And it's so true also from the cultural perspective. If you consider that I've been working with 9 different countries, 9 different languages, different religions, different time zones. These all are about accepting, embracing, knowing more about diversity and trying to have, the kind of equality and equity in the way in which we are communicating and coping with each other. And it's so true, especially in the SaaS world, where you have to know more about the others. And you have definitely need to set the scene and to know the people you are working with or the customer you have to know in terms of needs and change with those people. I think we're going to cover this about people analytics later in the conversation, but it's very much important to consider all the perspectives and all the dimensions in the way people want to be treated. They want to be treated not the same way I want to be treated. And that's, the multifaceted dimension that diversity includes. And I'm curious by definition, so I really love to know more about the other.
I love that. Thank you for that, Sarah. And that actually, you touched on something important about how people want to be treated. And I think, Cynthia, you touch on this all the time with highlighting the differences between diversity and inclusion. And you have a really good analogy about a party. I'd love for you to showcase that for all of the people that are asking, like, well, what is the difference between diversity and inclusion? Why do you need them both? The way I actually learned it from you. So I would love it if you could share with us the difference between inclusion and diversity.
Sure. So diversity is inviting everyone to the party. This is the analogy that I use. And I'm almost positive I must have gotten it from someone else. And inclusion, though, is everybody gets to dance, right? Everybody has a space where they can join and belong in just in their authenticness. And they don't have to change. I think Sarah really touched on a point that if you have to change to be part of the conversation, then it's not a diverse or inclusive conversation. And, I remember when I was little, my dad, we would always just cringe every time he would start dancing because we're like, oh my gosh, you're just embarrassing us. And when I think about it, it's like because he was dancing in his way, which was different than we were dancing in our way. And I think, again, kind of going back to that party, inviting everyone to the dance and then making sure everybody can dance. Just because someone dances differently than you are, has a different rhythm, doesn't make it bad. It actually makes it good. It makes it a much more richer experience for everyone.
Yeah, I agree. It's interesting that you say that. I was reading this article. It was highlighted why belonging matters. It launched yesterday, I believe. It was from a guy named Mike. I have to find the information. But when I was reading the article, he really touched on some things about he's an African American male. And he was really good at his job and was always working twice as hard. And, it's his first tech company out of 4 tech companies that he's been to where he actually feels belonged. And he talks about that and really highlights a scenario or a moment where he thought he belonged. And there was actually a happy hour that his entire team went to. And he didn't know about it until he was actually in the meeting the next day. And they were just talking about it freely. And it was almost like a jab at him because they knew he wasn't invited, but they continued to conversate about that happy hour that they had the night before. And he said that, that was years ago in the article. And he says, that still stung. And then he also highlighted all these different game rooms that you have in the tech companies. And he always said he never felt inclined to take a break and, play in the game room. And he says the first moment he did it, he actually got just a little note from his boss saying, well, I hope you finished your assignment. Make sure your assignment is, ready by the deadline. And it was this first time ever just playing in the game room. But, that really stood out because you never think about what's going on in that individual's thought process. And, you never think long term how that's going to affect you. All it takes is not being invited to the party, right? All it takes is your entire team playing golf or having a happy hour and you're off of that invite. And it makes a big impact. And that actually gets me to my next segment of, if you're focused on diversity and inclusion, and also from a leadership perspective, when you're managing a team, and Mark, I'll address this to you, where does equity actually come into the equation?
Yes, we just briefly touch upon the 4 elements that are all connected with one each other, right? So diversity, inclusion, belonging, and equity. So equity is very important. It's about constantly and consistently recognizing and redistributing power. So it could be economic power, it could be communication power, it could be decisional power. But regardless of what power we talk about, it's about providing this environment where there is an active involvement, especially from the leadership team, to ensure that everybody has the same access to this, between quotes, power thing. But you don't do it by, you don't have to confuse this with equality, which is another concept. So the concept of equality is that you give everybody the same things. Equity is different. Equity recognizes that each person has different circumstances or different history and allocates those resources that are useful for those individuals to participate fully in the conversation or in the decision process or in the voices of the company, right? So equality is a difficult thing to achieve, because the concept is easy, right? You give to each individual what they need to excel, depending on their level and their needs. But then it's very difficult to make it practical, right? So I'll give an example about learning and upskilling people. Usually in companies, you have programs that push training to people, but all at the same level, right? There's a training, a video or a workshop, and everybody receives the same help. But as we said, individuals may be different. They may need different things. So one way to achieve equity is to differentiate those training or upskill programs depending on the needs of everybody. Yeah, and obviously that brings to the next level of the conversation, which is belonging. So once you have diversity, which you can only realize when you have inclusion, then from the inclusion you go to equity, and the three of these elements really give the belonging concept that you were talking about earlier, which is really where you want to be. You want to get to the belonging feeling from people.
Yeah, completely agree.
I agree. And when thinking about that, and I'll open this up to everyone, if we look at this from a SaaS perspective, and we look at most tech companies right now are really focused on driving diversity and inclusion in their recruiting standpoint. But what I've been realizing is, what about the retention and also the churn of those diverse individuals? And I think when you touched on the three elements, Marco, that gets us to the belonging. Do you feel as though in our SaaS industry, we have to do a bit of a better job at actually getting to that belonging standpoint within the tech industry? And I'll open this up, maybe Sarah, Cynthia, what are your thoughts on that? Why is that piece so important, and why does that really affect our recruiting numbers?
Well, I think it affects the recruiting numbers in a couple of ways. So, tech, while it's really big, to me, it's also very small, right? We're very insular. And if we don't focus on both, not only recruitment, but retention, we're going to lose talent. And when you start losing talent, it impacts the bottom line for the business. And that is hugely, hugely important. And so it really makes sense. And this work is not easy. So as we're talking, I don't want the audience to think, oh, all we have to do is make sure we've got a lot of different people and we work to make sure their voices are heard. This takes very thoughtful, intentional work by leaders and by programming. I think, we haven't talked about this, but a lot of DEI programs fail. One of the reasons they fail is that it's not embedded in the business. So if it sits off to the side, you give the impression that we're going to have a start and a stop to it. And from my perspective, it's ongoing work. It's lifelong, because we are all human and imperfect and imperfect. And what that means is that sometimes we're going to succeed and sometimes we're going to fail. So sometimes we're going to be great at creating a sense of belonging, and then sometimes we are not. I just noticed there's a question in the chat around, what do you do if someone on the team doesn't embrace it? And I think that really, as a leader, for me, that would mean having a much more candid and one-on-one conversation with that person to uncover what is going on with them, right? Because typically when folks start pushing back on something, there's a trigger or something in their background and their culture, something about how they've come around that has created this reaction. And I think this is where being curious really can be to your benefit. And that is, ask questions, find out what's driving that person, what excites them, discover their origin story, because I think that will give you the keys and the information you need to actually be able to bring them in so that they feel a sense of belonging, because the reason could be that they just don't feel like they belong either. And so they haven't seen it work. They never feel like they are part of the conversation or included. And so they drop out. But if you take the time to be curious and uncover that, I think that can go a long way.
I agree 100%. And Sarah, anything you want to add to that, especially around the analytic piece? I know you do a lot of research on that.
Yeah, and I also have to answer to a question that I can read into the chat. Simple example of the effects of not being inclusive, especially in my job. When we used to have in-person events, and you have to manage, the pocket lunch or the brown bag or this kind of stuff, which refers to meals, you try to serve and to be equal and to set equity. But we did, and it's happening frequently, we did mistakes when we served the same meal to every customers at the event, even though if it's a CXO event, right? So you are targeting these are decision makers. And you can have the biggest topics, the perfect presentation, keynote speakers at the top of. And then you have the feedback forms in which you have the feedback, I'm vegetarian and I didn't eat anything at your event. And this is a way in which you can really do a great thing in terms of content, and you are missing to include and to embrace the diversity. So knowing more, and it comes to the analytics and the way in which people analytics are affecting not only the internal company decision, but also the relationship that we have with our customers and partners, and how much is important to set the scenario, to know more, especially in our fast-paced environment in which things are changing so fast. And, the product development shouldn't be so slow to wait for this kind of feedback. I'm vegetarian and you serve me something that I couldn't eat. You need to act more fast. And we have some good example even in our industry, like I think that you heard about Snapchat and the way in which basically they set a more inclusive camera when they discovered basically that they had a camera for their Snapchat that was designed only for white-skinned people. And when they surveyed and they had a clearer view of the population of the users of Snapchat, and they see that the white-skinned people for which they have designed the camera settings are just a minority of the users of the application, they immediately change those to be, useful and to be applied to a wider side of the population. This is a good example on how knowing more, be curious, not only internally from the company perspective, but also with a sharp eye to what's happening externally, to your customers, to your partners, to all the stakeholders. It's really, really important to make them feel included and treated in an equitable way, like Cynthia mentioned and Marco specify even more in details. The belonging side is really important, and how they feel, because they are buying when you are stop selling. And it is very powerful.
I'm glad you brought that up, Sarah, because I think all of us on this phone call and our day jobs, we actually all touch customers. From an advocacy perspective, customer advocacy perspective, I'm glad you touched on that, Sarah, because we take the time to send these surveys in advance, and it highlights, your dietary restrictions. It highlights, what would you prefer? And you never realize until the event actually is over. Either you have a customer that is raving about the little tiny things that you thought about, or they're giving you that feedback and they're saying, you had no meat, or you didn't do this for me. And you don't realize long term how that makes someone feels. And then, from a customer perspective, after doing different studies, you realize customers stay long-term with you because of how they feel from a value perspective. They see you as a partner, not just as a product. And when we think about that as from an employee standpoint and also from a leadership perspective, I believe people stay long term. It goes back to the original saying, people don't leave jobs, they leave bad bosses. And I think that ultimately it goes back to that belonging standpoint. When you have a great team that listens to you, that gives feedback and is willing to understand your concerns, it's not always going to be perfect, but when you actually feel heard, that's how you have longevity. And that brings me into my next question. We all manage different people on our teams, and I want to hear from you all from a diverse perspective, and this goes from, different genders, different religions, etc. Individuals that are joining. When you're thinking about managing a large team, how do you make sure people feel included and that their voices are heard, and that they actually belong? How do you actually secure that from, if you have 2 people on your team all the way to 15, 20, you name it, how do you actually get that right? And maybe Marco, let's kick it off with you.
So first of all, it's a relentless work, right? There's no recipe that you can use and change things from one day to the other. It just takes time. It certainly starts from the leadership team. You have to embed diversity and inclusion into what every leader does. And you can do this in many ways. You can obviously open up the conversation. You can come up with programs that help leaders understand the value of and how to behave to be better, inclusive leaders. But then it gets down to establishing a movement in the company. This is not about having a checklist of things that you have to do. This is about changing the culture and changing the mindset of everybody, right? And obviously, depending on your company may get it, and so you do it across the company. But if your company does not have a structured approach, it doesn't matter. You can start from your team and you can do amazing things. And this is not just for making sure that your team become better humans because they are richer in a way, but it's also because it's good for the business and it's good for your customers. And so Sarah made the example of Snapchat. I work in B2B, in a B2B environment, but still we have to deal with humans, right? It's really business to human for us. And so having that complexity or that numerosity of diversity in your team, it helps to be able to pick the right people to have them interact with the customers. But going back to your question, how do you actually make it? Well, you have to create an environment, a safe environment. Some of us call it psychological safety. It means you have to ensure that people are happy and don't fear of speaking up. And when you do that both because you can establish, programs like an allyship program. So you institutionalize it. You ensure that employees help each other. You can foster or ensure that there are groups of employees that get together. Many ways of doing it. But really is about respecting people. It's about ensuring that everybody can speak up and bring their own voice. And also as a leader, you have to work a little bit behind the scenes, right? You have to go to individual people and say, can you help me sharing, more details about this event or this festivity in your religion? Don't be shy, I will support you. So you have that person come out and then you support that person publicly and say, yes, this is interesting, this is good. And to be honest, I find it personally very interesting. I just learn because as Cynthia said, you need to be curious, or as Sarah said, you need to be curious, right? And I am curious by nature. And I really love to learn new points of view and new ways and new habits. Long answer,
yes,
sorry.
sometimes also intrusive. And if I can add a bit, sometimes also reframing intrusive personal questions around the way maybe we normally feel or act around the topic and have an active listening on the replies. It's working a lot because every brain has unconscious biases, and sometimes a question more helps you to understand better and to know more and to be more respectful because now you know. And it's really, really important because it's not even, sometimes you don't even consider something which is really relevant for the others because it's not part of your culture, it's not part of your gender, it might be, it's not even part of your religion, ethnicity, of your color again. And, we see the color and we embrace the diversity, knowing more about the others. And it's good also for the business because we have a lot of research saying that inclusion, equity, and diversity applied into companies leads to more revenues and more agile and flexibility towards, any kind of business.
Yeah, it's interesting, Sarah. Earlier last week when we were chatting, you made a good point about when people say they don't see color. She's like, you said, no, that's bad. Like you need to see color. And it stood out because I realized, in most companies, people don't like to talk about diversity and inclusion because it's a tricky conversation, and they don't want to be seen in a negative light. So they choose to just not say anything at all. And I think that that's the worst thing, of not addressing something or, I think everybody on the call has said it, be curious, and I think that shapes being a good leader, because if you know it all, how can you actually be a thoughtful leader? But if you're open to being challenged and open to not always being right, but eager to learn, I think we create better environments for all. And so I love that point that you put, Sarah, just about, just see the differences. So then you can actually make change. And before there's some questions in the chat that I want to get to, but Cynthia, I want to see if you want us to chime in on that segment before we get into that Q&A.
Yeah, I mean, I think I echo and agree with what Marco and Sarah have said. And, we've been talking a lot about the things we can see, but there's so much intersectionality of the things we can't see. So if someone has hearing challenges, you can't actually physically see that. And they have created and adapted to moving through the world. And so it may be even less visible because maybe they're not using sign because they read lips really well. And I think it's really important to know that just because you can't see it doesn't mean there's not a difference there. And that to me is where the really rich work comes in, where having that one-on-one contact that Marco was talking about, and not just to bring people out. We have people who are more introverted than extroverted, and presenting and talking in front of people is like one of the biggest fears. I think there's been research done. It's like that, death, and taxes or something are like the top things that people really fear. And when you think about that, sometimes they have really important things to say, great ideas, but they're just shy. So how do you connect with them one-on-one and encourage and give them a space to be able to do that? So I think all of those things go into really exemplifying why this is so important, because we can't always see the bias. To Sarah's point, we've all got unconscious bias, and you just never know when it's going to come up. And kind of, I call it like tapping you on the shoulders, like, wait a minute, was that what you thought it was? Or, just take a step back. Sometimes when I have an immediate reaction to something, I really do challenge myself to take a step back, think about it, and then lean in again. Because sometimes our immediate reaction is really reaction based on our bias and not based on our true intent. And if you pause and think, and again, going back to curiosity, ask a question, that can also start to uncover and just give you the ability to grow.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And can I add to that, Cynthia? I totally agree. The unconscious bias is part of us. That's how we are made. It's, humans are like that. The point here is, if you develop this habit of being open and, trying to force yourself sometimes to ask the questions and to look for what the others say rather than making an opinion by your own, then that's how you fight unconscious bias, together with having other people around you that have different unconscious biases. And so, at the end, you realize you have to do something about that. So it's a very natural feeling to be biased, but in a way, we can try to fight it somehow.
I think you can take it to your advantage. Like as you were talking, like just saying you're in a group of like 5 or 6 people and you all have different unconscious biases, right? And again, this kind of speaks to the power of diversity and inclusion, which is the bias I have may not be the bias you have. And so we can learn from each other and grow within that dialogue. So kind of going back to Kalina's point that folks shy away from it because it's an uncomfortable conversation, and it doesn't have to be. The one thing that I kind of, the metaphor I like to use is like a 3-year-old they're learning how to speak, right? They usually can say they know the people around them really well, but there's some words they can't quite put together. And we wouldn't tell them to be quiet while they're trying to learn how to talk. We encourage them to keep speaking. So I think the same has to go for having conversations and doing the work around diversity, equity, inclusion. It is going to feel uncomfortable at times. It is going to be scary. You are going to make mistakes. And just bring out your 3-year-old and I'm going to try it again. Because every single time we try, we do it a little bit better. We get a little bit more confidence, and it does become more comfortable.
Agreed.
I agree. That's wonderful. I love that. So what I hear so far from everyone is it's a muscle, right? You have to keep challenging yourself. You have to fight some of your biases. It's literally a muscle. If you don't, I always look at it as if you don't work out every day, you lose it, right? So that's why you constantly check on your health. You constantly push. And that's the same thing with diversity and inclusion and equity. If you want equality for all and you want people to feel that you want people to be in a belonging environment, you constantly work at it. And I think that's just the ultimate goal of diverse voices. And before we go on to the next question, it looks like we had a question from an audience member. It says, should diversity and inclusion and equity be an intentional byproduct effective leadership / should leadership compensation plus key performance indicator tie up to the contribution to diversity, equity, and inclusion?
That's a very good question.
That's a very deep one.
Really, really rich question. It is. There's lots of layers in there.
Yeah. So let me try to start come up with an answer. So naturally, you will find that some leaders are more inclined into a diversity and inclusion conversation because it's who they are, right? I think about me, been traveling forever, really curious, genuinely curious. So I'm now in a working environment that enables me to express myself in this area. Very happy. So when I do things in this area with my team or in my company, I don't do it for, because there's a KPI attached to it. I just do it because I think there's value and I really like it. And I get positive feedback from the team and from the people, and we just continue to do this. But maybe we were lucky. So there may be other people who are not into this state yet. So I think if you look at, corporation, a company, or a larger group of people, you probably want to have some of the KPIs, even, attached to your targets, that change the habits of those people who are a little bit lagging behind. And that's how you, in a way, force them to appreciate what this is all about, and hopefully then they become leaders in this conversation and leave the space to the others to catch up. So I think it is not bad if you create a system where you push people to think and do activities about diversity and inclusion. Obviously you need to have some inspired leaders in this area to really bring the energy.
Yeah, I think it's a really layered and complex. Oh, go ahead, Sarah. Sorry.
Oh, go ahead, Cynthia. You first.
I think, it's a layered conversation, which I think kind of is Marco's point. Like, you're going to have people that have a natural inclination and want to do the work. And for them, whether you have a KPI around it or tied to their performance, doesn't matter. They will do the work anyway. And you will have those who feel like they're not equipped to do it. they feel like they're not trained to do it. They're afraid of it. And so they may lean back a bit. And I think for those people, that's where the systems, programs, accountability becomes very important. And there's always going to be a group of people that just literally don't agree. And I think, as with any part of your company culture and environment, you're going to have those three groups, right? People that naturally embrace and are going to excel and be strong leaders and be really, I would say I'm into servant leadership, so I'm going to use that term, but they will be servant leaders. You're going to have another group that just needs help. They need to know what the tools are and the programming to support them, and they will do the work. And the other group is going to maybe drop out, but the ideal is to have more of the people that want to do the work and embrace and make your organization thrive and grow in a really great way, and have fewer of the people that just kind of step out. And I would say the leaders that step out over time, they actually don't tend to stay with really great, thriving organizations, because you can only thrive if you have great leadership. And when you have leaders that don't quite embrace that, they will stay for a period of time and then they will leave. And that's exactly what you want, right? You want a really strong leadership team that sees this work as important, that understands the value of it, and just inherently believes like this is the way we should move around the world.
It brings up to another thought that popped in my head. It always starts up from the top, right? When you think about your culture, it trickles down. So if you're in an environment where you experience all this toxic, just moments, it always starts from the top. And if you experience all these diversity and inclusion opportunities and trainings and all these requirements for you to get to know everyone and having ERGs, that all starts, and it looks like someone actually put, we have to be intentional until we can be organic. When you think about it from our leadership perspective, all of that is intentional. You have people that are sitting in the room literally deciding, what are we going to do about diversity and inclusion? Where are we lacking? How can we improve? But if you don't have that conversation in those boardrooms, if you don't have that conversation within your weekly leadership meeting, how can you expect your team to think about this? And how do you expect your team to be conscious about diversity and inclusion? And then lastly, when you hire, how can you expect your new employees to think that way too, if you don't even have that embedded into your foundation?
Yeah.
I think that's just spot on. And so we have about 14 minutes, or actually 13 minutes left. I did want to touch on the importance of allyship in the workforce, because we do have a very diverse group of individuals on the call. So wanted to get your thoughts on, we can't do this work alone, obviously, right? It's not a I person in this work, especially in SaaS. And we have to be able to teach and also learn. And so what I've discovered is there's individuals that generally don't understand why we have diversity and inclusion, but they want to be an ally. But I want to get your thoughts on, what is the importance of even being an ally, and what is the type of work that they have to put in to make sure that we really drive positive change for the industry? And I'm wondering, Cynthia, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I think allyship, to your point, it's not an I conversation, right? This is all about we and us. And I'm going to use that in the biggest possible way. So it's beyond this panel, it's beyond our audience. It really is this huge we with a group of us, like global citizenry, sorry. And I think it is absolutely important, because we can't do it alone. And again, we bring different perspectives, and you need allies to speak up when you're not in the room, when whoever that person is, or individual or persona, when they're not in the room, that's when allyship is actually its most powerful and it's most needed, because you speak for the folks who can't speak for themselves. And, I do a lot of volunteer work, and folks are like, how do we find time to do it? And I started doing it at a very young age. And what I quickly realized was it fed my soul. It made me actually feel better to know that I was contributing and helping another person. And again, I think if you take it down to the human piece of this, it becomes something that is so much easier to do than we make it out to be. Like, it sounds big and hard, and it is. I'm not going to, deny the reality of that it's hard work, but I think some of that hardness and complexity we bring upon ourselves. And if we can get it down to, hey, if I can actually speak up and give somebody else space, that does two things. It helps them and it helps me. It's like not asking for help. You deny two people. You deny the person who wants to help you, and you deny yourself the help that you need. And I think that is so important as a term, and that's the kind of bring it back to allyship. And that, to me, that's what allyship is. It's like, it's having that person who's going to stick up for me or whoever it is, whatever group it is, when they're not in the room, or they could be in the room and not being given the space. Going back to the first part of our conversation, they're not being actually given the opportunity and the space to share their voice and to lean in. So it could be something as simple as being in a meeting where there's lots of voices, all the extroverts are chatting away, and you know that there's a person in the room who has something really important to say that would be of value to the group, and they're not talking. All you have to do is say, you know what, I think I was talking to whoever it was the other day, and I think they actually have a really good point to make. Would you like to say something? And just simply doing that, or saying, actually, I wasn't the person that led the work. It was actually my coworker. Even if you were the leader, right? You just open up that space. And to me, all of those things are allyship.
Mm-hmm. That's spot on. I'm the moderator here, but I'm also taking notes. I think you guys are just, I'm like, oh, that's amazing. I'm putting that down too.
We are all doing that because we have, so many things to learn in every occurrence.
That's true. It looks like we do have a question coming up, but wanted to make sure if you guys want to chime in on anything else with allyship before we go into that question.
Yeah, I think that Cynthia summarized very well. I have some, words that resonate very well with the terms of ally, like, amplifier, sponsor, champion, someone who uses influence and power to emphasize the other's voice. So the importance of the voices that are not heard and respected. And this is really, really important. I think that during the conversation that we had, we defined the main traits of the inclusive leader, and the fact that the E&I shouldn't stay in the HR department, but should start from everybody of us as individuals, as people, because we are all humans and we are all diverse. And we love to feel included, and we love to be treated in an equal way. And so allyship it's really, really important, because we do not have the same tools, the same positions, the same power, the same influence. And I think that also from the women's perspective, we rise by lifting others. And that's exactly the concept that I love behind the word of ally. I mean,
the attitude. If I may add to everything that has been said, which I totally agree with, allyship is about systematically breaking privileges, right? So if you think about the example of introverts and extroverts, in a way, if you are in a meeting and having a conversation, in a way, it's a privilege to be an extrovert, because you are naturally inclined to speak up and say something, right? So when you do what Cynthia just said, right, earlier, is, Mr. or Mrs. X, I know you have an opinion on this, you want to share with everybody, you are breaking that privilege of all the extroverts in the room. You are enabling an introvert to speak up. And that's a magical thing to do. Because it's not because it's a leader doing this. It's not about authority at all. These can be done in between people in the team, right? Just become friends or ally with somebody, and just ensure that person has a voice.
And it's contagious. It's contagious.
Yeah, it is.
It's a good manner.
Really is.
It's really powerful, because everybody is, more propense to do the same, and it's really starting a new way of doing that.
We haven't talked about privilege much, Marco. Thank you for bringing that up. because I think that's also another key. That's a whole nother podcast we could talk about in terms of privilege, because it's also layered and very, very complex. But thanks for kind of pulling that together. I appreciate it.
Yeah. So far I have, Marco, you made a good point. Systematically breaking privileges. That is amazing. And then Sarah, you chimed in, you said allyship is contagious. Or I summed it up saying, I threw in allyship is contagious. But, before we actually conclude, I think, Cynthia, you brought up a good point. We didn't really go in on privileges. And on here, I have a question that just highlights any additional tip we would like to share with the audience. And I would love it if we can share tips for our privileges, because I think that we all, no matter how diverse, background you come from, I think we do have a sense of privilege, regardless if you're in a leadership role, if you're an individual contributor, if you're an African American woman, Italian man, Italian woman. I think we do have an opportunity to showcase and do good with our privileges. So want to just go around and share a few tips on, I guess maybe even define for some people, what is privilege inside our industry and how do you use it for good?
I mean, I think, and again, I'm not an expert, so please, this is just my perspective and point of view on it. But I define privilege as something that you didn't have to work for, right? Like you just showed up and it was there. And, I used to call it an accident of birth. It's like I have a lot of privilege based on where I was born, the parents I had, the way I grew up. And I think in tech and in SaaS, we all walk around with a certain amount of privilege. So it's just something like, that just, it's organic. It's just there. And so sometimes I think folks, especially recently, have felt really bad when someone says, you come and you're using your privilege. You can use your privilege for good. It does not have to be a bad thing. And I think that's what Marco was really highlighting for us, is that use your influence, use your power to actually create that space and break the privilege. I really, really love that phrase, because that's really what we want to do. Use it for good, break it. Because when you do that, you create a much more equitable system. You create a much more equitable environment for everyone, which takes us all the way back to the beginning of the conversation around belonging and inclusion. So for me, I think that's definitely one of the things I think all of us in this industry can definitely do. In terms of tips for folks, there's so much work, there's so much programming, courses you can take. And I encourage everyone, just start the conversation. You don't have to spend $2,000 going to a workshop. You can join webinars like this. You can have conversations with your teams, with the folks that are around you, your peers, the folks that work for you, the people that you work for. You really can start this in a much more organic way. And I think in some companies, it's easier than others. And for the most part, a lot of large organizations are very much focused on this today. And I would say take advantage of that. The time is now. If you've been hesitant before, jump in now, because I think people are much more open to having that conversation. And I also want to go back. There was one more question, I think that was earlier in the chat, about when I talked about kind of the three groups of folks that you can have: people that embrace organically, who will do the work, and then the folks that won't. And the question was, what do you approach and include the folks who won't? Absolutely. Because again, if you ask questions, you just don't know why they're resident. You don't know why they are stepping back. And I think, and this won't apply to everyone, but if you take the time to be curious and ask questions and get to know them and get to know their story and be more familiar, you build comfort. And with that, that's how we change hearts, right? And when you change hearts, you can change minds.
I was thinking, I totally agree on what you just said, everything that you said. I think that to me, I look at my team. My team is a very diverse team. We have nationalities and citizenships from, let's say Africa to Europe. So very, very different ways of approaching things and behaviors. And it gets overly complicated because of sometimes the cultural imprint. Yeah, some cultures are more open to accept this new wave of behaviors that we have these days, and we all work for American companies, so in a way, in our companies, that's the imprint, right, here in the panel. But there may be some cultures which limit that idea of breaking the privileges, right? So you may end up into delicate situations where you're saying things in the company which are all in the interest of, breaking the privileges, having people speak up, and instill this idea of non-be retaliated, whatever they say, because any idea is good at the table. It's just a different point of view. But then when they go back into their cultures, in their family lives, they still have that, limit. So okay, we would need to have like hours of conversations about this, but it's very interesting because then you become a precursor for them in their lives to, ensure that they have this mindset, open mindset, and that there is a way for them to express themselves fully. So I think as a practical suggestion here is you have to be, if you're a leader, but also if you're part of a team that wants to, use diversity and inclusion as a way of progressing, you have to really push yourself and be open to respect the points of view of the others, to, in a way, understand that sometimes you have a privilege and you never really realized, but because you were never confronted, because you were never really had an open conversation with people. So yeah, practical tip is just be open, so curious and open, because you will be surprised. You will realize you may be privileged and you never thought about that.
And I would add just a pragmatical tip of where to start. Start questioning yourself. If you are individual contributors, what am I doing for an inclusive environment? If you are leading a team, try to start asking questions to your team and try to know more, to have a map of where we are. You don't know what you don't measure, so start creating a map of your team, who they are, which kind of indicators, what are you doing if they are, practicing inclusion, equality, and diversity, and you don't know, you just, set a list, a very simple list. So you just have a starting point to, jump into a conversation which might be diverse from the usual ones you have in a professional environment, but you are starting that, and you are really changing in that way, because everything counts, I think, and it's important to start.
I agree. Well, I want to thank Cynthia, Sarah, Marco so much for just tuning in. If you want to hear more with Cynthia, she's actually a guest speaker already on my podcast on unapologetic.com. And also we are rolling out a new allyship segment, which I'm hoping Marco and Sarah would love to highlight and go deeper in the conversation in the upcoming month.
Pleasure.
But thank you so much, and take care, everyone.
And
thank you very much for having us.
Thank you to Kalina as well. Thank you to all the speakers.
Thank you. My pleasure.
And thanks for joining us, everyone. We'll see you in the next talk.
Yep.